Hello there. Ever since the rise of the Empire in 19 BBY and the execution of Order 66 to take out the entirety of the Jedi Order, there have always been rebel factions out there fighting against the Empire since day one. A short few amount of the actual factions that actually fought the Empire since day one were Saw Gerrera, the Hidden Path, Clone Force 99, and even Captain Rex, who started his very own clone rebellion. So today, we are going to talk about the rebel troops, how they were armed, what they were equipped with, and how they managed to make everything work out for them in the end, since they eventually destroyed the Empire. So without further ado, here we go. But first, as always, we begin with a little bit of a breakdown. The original alliance started off with the delegation of 2,000, basically 2,000 senators from different planets all across the entirety of the galaxy, which demanded that Chancellor Palpatine lay down his emergency powers so he can end the Clone Wars effectively, and so we could bring peace to the entirety of the galaxy. Unfortunately, this didn't really turn out the way everybody wanted, considering the fact that just about a couple of days later, Palpatine basically turned the entirety of the Republic into the Empire and destroyed any chance of peace because he basically became a tyrant throughout the entirety of the galaxy. But effectively, the main initial leaders of the Delegation of 2000 were obviously Padme Amidala, Mon Mothma, and Bail Organa, which ended up with Padme Amidala being killed at the very end of Revenge of the Sith, while Mon Mothma and Bail Organa basically initially funded their very own rebel factions. And a lot of this funding would go to making sure that the Rebel Alliance had many arms and weaponry, as well as vehicles and machinery that they needed to take on the Empire, which were all basically just scrapped up units that were thrown to the side by the Empire so they can make way for the brand new machinery that was coming up next. A lot of the weapons that the Rebel Alliance was using basically were trash weapons that the Empire didn't want anymore because they made their own blasters. All of the vehicles were all trash from the Clone Wars and from the time of the Republic, and as were the starfighters and the initial capital ships. Basically, everything that the Empire didn't want, they threw in the trash, and the Rebel Alliance basically picked it all up and used that scrap to basically make their own army. Now, even though the Rebel Alliance was basically using a lot of trash during the time of between 19 BBY and 0 BBY, they actually had a lot of good weaponry. The A280 and the A280C blaster rifles were probably the best rifles that they could afford and the best rifles that they can get their hands on. The DL44 and the DL18s were basically the greatest pistols that they could grab their hands on top of that. And the DLT-19 was the heavy weapon that they used for real extreme circumstances when they were facing off against entire hordes of stormtroopers. And along with that, the rebellion would use other means of weaponry, just like the DH-17, the A-180, the DLT-20A, the Roba M45, the Volk TAU-623 blast mill rotary blaster cannon, the Z6 rotary blaster cannon, and the Mark II EWHB-10, along with the E11 blaster rifles, often captured by Imperial troops during time of conflict. And along with the weapons, there were also several other different vehicles that the Rebel Alliance got their hands on, like the T1, T2, and TB repulsor tanks and heavy attack tanks and hover tanks that they got their hands on throughout the entirety of the 19 years between the end of the Clone Wars all the way to the beginning of the Galactic Civil War, including the MLC-5 artillery, the AT-ET, the AT-TE, and the TX-130 Sabre-class fighter tank, and the ULAV company. And along with the ground vehicles and the weapons themselves, that doesn't include the massive amounts of starships that they also had on top of that, with the A-Wings, the X-Wings, the Y-Wing, and the B-Wing, along with the Alderaanian cruisers, also known as the Blockade Runners, the Nebulon Beef medical frigates, and the Mon Calamari cruisers, just to name a few. Not to mention the vast majority of the civilian ships that they used throughout the entirety of the wait time between 19 BBY and 0 BBY that would ultimately lead to the Rebel Alliance being created. Basically, any bit of trash that you could find out in the scrap yards that the Empire maintained, you could probably go to the Rebellion and they would pay for them, while also creating their own various outposts in outward worlds to basically have a station to where they could fight against the Empire and have a remote base. In fact, taking Imperial scraps was actually so common that they literally took old rusted up and old banged up AT-AT and AT-ST walkers and basically used the Empire's own weapons against them to effectively give themselves an advantage on the battlefield. Any blaster, any launcher, any grenade, any type of body armor, any vehicle, any speeder, any starfighter, any capital ship that they could find, that they could get a hold of, that they could heavily modify for their own needs, they would take them and they would use them against the Empire at full force because they were a little crazy. and eventually wouldn't be long until the actual Rebel Alliance was created. After 19 years of conflict, guerrilla tactics, and facing off against the Empire in every way, shape, and form that they could find, the Rebel Alliance was finally created after the destruction of Alderaan, and that basically brought all of them together to compete and fight as one solid unit, finally creating the Rebel Alliance. With the 5 initial leaders of the Rebel Alliance, of course, being Mon Mothma, who was the Alliance Chief of State, Bail Organa, the Senator of Alderaan, who unfortunately was destroyed during the destruction of the planet, but who was a key figure in the early days of the rebellion, Admiral Akbar, who was the Supreme Commander of the Alliance Fleet, General Jan Dodona, who was a high-ranking general, Krix Madine, who was the Supreme Commander of Special Forces, and Aaron Kraken, who was the Supreme Commander of Intelligence. And along with the 5 initial leaders of the Rebel Alliance, there were a whole host of different individuals that actually contributed to the Rebel Alliance, like Han Solo, Chewbacca, Leia Organa, Luke Skywalker, Ahsoka Tano, Cassian Andor, Hera Syndulla, Jyn Erso, Wedge Antilles, Ezra Bridger, Kanan Jarrus, Lando Calrissian, and many, many, many others. With each and every person contributing in their own way, shape, and form to the Rebel Alliance and to the eventual destruction of the Empire, and especially the Emperor as well as Lord Vader during the Battle of Endor.